Welcome to this story, one of the most unsettling cases ever noted in the Missouri River region. Before we dive in, share in the comments where you're tuning in from and the exact time you started listening. It's always interesting to see the different places and hours of the day or night where these stories reach. In the spring of 1875, in the low, shifting bottoms along the Missouri River, the settlement of Cedar Bluff, little more than a cluster of cabins, a blacksmith's shed, and a rickety general store, was stirring awake under cloudy skies, an uneasy wind teasing the river's muddy edges. The Missouri River itself, known to locals as the Big Muddy, long before steamboats pushed its treacherous currents for trade and transport, defined life here, its moods unpredictable, its channels quick to reshape the land and the lives of all who dwelled near it. Cedar Bluff lay on a stretch of bank that had seen years of shifting channels. One year the river touched a thicket of cottonwoods. The next, those same trees stood a mile inland. Late snows that spring had swelled the Big Muddy beyond usual, flooding low pastures and leaving wetlands that buzzed with insects by midday. But it was not the water that would trouble this story's memory, nor solely the wilderness that pressed near, but what befell one of the settlement's fiercest hunters, Elias Markham. Markham arrived in Cedar Bluff only a year prior. Records in the county ledger describe him as a taciturn man of fair build, who bore both scars and stories from the plains west of the river. In his few conversations with neighbors, Markham spoke of distant homesteads and lost horses, but always returned to tales of grisly sightings, odd, given the land's usual brown bear range had thinned decades earlier. He seemed, to some, overly convinced a great bear still roamed the forested ridges near what settlers called Bear Hollow. Markham laughed off caution, and at times left others uneasy with the way he watched shadows cling to trees like something waiting. On the night of April 12, a light snow fell. Temperatures dipped near freezing before dawn. The next morning, neighbors found Markham's trapline abandoned, snares empty. His last campfire was stoked only with cold coals. Tracks led north toward Bear Hollow, large, deep impressions in the wet ground, unlike anything most local hunters had ever seen. Some said they spoke of weight and bewilderment, as recorded by Deputy Clerk Josiah Lyle in an affidavit lodged weeks later. The first official report described the tracks in sober terms, beyond the scope of any known bear footprint in the region, it read, but then added something else, a series of prints leading away from the supposed bear trails that suggest two-legged motion in the same rough gait. By that afternoon, the settlers had spread out in small groups, rifles slung, dogs baying. Every search returned with the same results. The woods seemed hollow around them, but there was no sign of Markham, not even a snapped branch where he might have struggled. More unsettling were the rumors that peppered conversations at the store and in scattered letters sent home to kin further east. Mrs. Abigail Turner, a widow who kept the store ledger, wrote to her sister that some settlers whispered of hearing a deep roaring lament in the night, more like anguished speech than any beast I have heard. Another farmhand, Samuel Creel, swore early one foggy dawn he saw a hulking shape draped in ragged fur, walking upright, with eyes like embers in the gloom. Most dismissed these as fear talking, yet fear was not so easy to dismiss in Cedar Bluff, as the river swollen its banks and nightfalls grew long. By the third week of April, the county marshal, Henry Atwood, arrived from the territorial seat with his own deputy and a single bloodhound. Atwood had seen his share of frontier trouble, train robbers, horse thieves, disputes over claim lines, and he treated the strange report with brisk skepticism. In his official notes, he remarked that blizzards in the Black Hills often drove wildlife far from their usual ranges, but he also cautioned, "We must not conjure phantoms where a bear might wander, nor saddle old woods with new specters." He assigned one extra patrol to comb Bear Hollow at first light. What they found at the edge of the thicket was a set of prints larger than any grizzly's, tamped into clay so deeply that the guides in the party later told Atwood they felt like impressions left by something that waded in its own shadow. In the notebooks of that patrol, now archived among county records, one scout, Thomas Ridley, wrote under his breath, "Not animal, not quite man." The rest of his notes were crossed out, a rarity in such official documents, as if even Ridley knew this might never be believed. Yet all of this remains within the realm of misplaced wildlife and overactive imaginations, until the day Marshal Atwood found the tracks that led not into the woods but toward the river itself, where the soil was soft and the current swift. By late April, the community of Cedar Bluff had begun to stir with talk, the rumors having spread far beyond the bounds of town. What had been whispered behind closed doors was now spoken openly, and as the days stretched into warmer weeks, the sheriff's office began receiving letters from neighboring settlements, each one more concerned, more uneasy than the last. Some reports suggested that wild bears were far from the only threat in these parts. People spoke of strange sightings, figures in the fog. A pair of glowing eyes watched from the water's edge late at night. Yet, despite all the growing unease, it was still the last report that would eventually alter the town's memory of the incident forever. In early May, Marshal Atwood set out again with a small party of men. Their purpose was clear, to find Elias Markham, but this search led them to a place the marshal would not soon forget. It started, as many of these things do, with a simple discovery. In a bend of the Missouri River where the water had carved a deep bank, the search party found a peculiar disturbance in the earth. No one had expected to find anything, but the muddy soil around the riverbank seemed to have been recently disturbed, as if something, or someone, had been dragged through it. The marks were deep and large, larger than any human could have made alone. They were almost too large for any animal the group had encountered. The tracks led directly toward the river, where the water's edge had been churned into froth, the current pulling at what was now visible, a body. Elias Markham, if it could be said to still be Elias Markham, was found there, just beyond the current, half submerged in the tangled underbrush. The body was a sight both grotesque and bewildering. A bullet wound was found in the back of his head, though the remains were too mangled to determine whether the injury was the cause of death. What shocked the investigators were the hands, clawed, long, and half submerged in water, like a creature's that had taken the form of a man but forgotten the rules of its own shape. It was, as one of the men from the search party later described, as if nature had decided to mock the human frame. The sheriff's office sent for Dr. Jacob Lowe, a local physician and former military surgeon, who had once worked with soldiers during the Indian Wars. Lowe's analysis, delivered in a matter-of-fact manner, would give rise to even further confusion. He noted the strange way the flesh had been twisted, the joints unnaturally extended, and the wounds that appeared to have been inflicted by something far stronger than any man or bear. "This is no animal attack," Dr. Lowe's report would say. "These are no human wounds either. I have never seen anything like it." It was then that a new theory began to take root, a theory that had been growing on the periphery of Cedar Bluff's quieter voices. Could it be that Elias Markham had not been killed by a bear at all? Could something else have been waiting for him in the wilderness, something more terrifying than a wild animal? The community had seen enough strange happenings to fuel such a theory, and as word spread, the town grew restless. Residents began speaking of strange lights over the river, of figures appearing in the forest during the darkest hours, and of the old men who swore to have seen similar things when they were boys. Yet even more unsettling were the reports from several locals, including young Samuel Creel, who swore that Markham's body had not just been dragged to the river, it had been placed there. Creel's testimony hinted at a sinister intelligence behind the events. The theories grew wilder. One group of settlers believed Markham had somehow encountered an ancient spirit, an indigenous force that had watched over the Missouri River long before settlers arrived. Others began to speculate that the strange prints found around Bear Hollow had not belonged to an animal at all, but to something entirely different, something unnatural. Whispers of the man-bear became commonplace, even among the skeptical. Atwood, however, was not so easily swayed. Though the strange sighting reports persisted, his approach remained methodical. He sent for a series of reports, including from the local newspaper, the Cedar Bluff Chronicle, which chronicled the series of oddities surrounding Markham's disappearance. The paper printed a carefully written editorial distancing itself from the more fantastical rumors, but even in the printed words, the tone of unease was undeniable. The tragedy of Markham's death, they wrote, remains a somber mystery, and though it is no secret that wild creatures haunt the river's edge, no creature seen yet could account for the strange way he was found. The local townspeople, however, began to retreat from the river. The once bustling settlement felt deserted as families left in droves, seeking shelter in nearby towns and cities. It was not long before the Cedar Bluff that had once felt like a frontier community faded into the background of Missouri's history, leaving only fragments of its former self to be uncovered by the curious. The marks on the earth by the riverbank faded as the months passed, but the mystery of what happened to Elias Markham never fully dissipated. As winter fell, Cedar Bluff was abandoned. In the years that followed, the land became an eerie patch of wilderness, avoided by those who had heard the rumors. Even the river, which had once been a lifeblood to the settlement, became a silent witness to what had transpired. Though many would say that the case of Elias Markham had simply been one of misfortune, a tragic bear attack turned tale of superstition, the whispers about the strange nature of his death would echo in the stories of those who still remembered Cedar Bluff. As one elderly resident from a nearby town recalled years later, some things should stay buried in the river. In the years that followed, Cedar Bluff became a forgotten name, buried under layers of time and a creeping wilderness. But as often happens with unsettling histories, the story of Elias Markham would not simply fade into obscurity. Though the settlement had been abandoned, rumors persisted in the surrounding areas, particularly among those who still made their living from the land near the Missouri River. It wasn't just the strange manner of Markham's death that unsettled them. It was the uneasy silence that had descended on the riverbank where he was found. In the summer of 1882, a decade after the event, a new family moved to the area, John and Mary Albright, settlers who had made their way west from Illinois in search of new opportunities. They were unaware of the grim history that lingered in the air of Cedar Bluff, and they saw in the land the potential for a new beginning. A year later, however, they would add another chapter to the unsettling history of the area. John Albright was a practical man, a farmer by trade, and he was quick to notice the strange occurrences that began to unfold once his family settled into the old cabin. It started with odd sounds in the night, thuds, scratches, and low growls that seemed to come from the riverbank, just beyond the trees. At first, John attributed them to the usual nocturnal creatures of the wilderness. But when his dogs began to act out of character, growling at unseen things in the dark and refusing to venture near the riverbank, he grew concerned. One evening, after several nights of restless sleep, John decided to investigate. Armed with a lantern and his rifle, he ventured out toward the river. What he found, however, was not what he expected. There, near the water's edge, were the same deep, large tracks that had been found all those years ago, though this time they were fresher, the edges still sharp as if they had been left only hours earlier. The tracks were unmistakable, and John's heart sank as he recognized them from the stories the locals had whispered about for years. These were no ordinary animal tracks. They were too large and too unnaturally shaped. John's investigation only deepened the mystery. He followed the tracks along the riverbank for several miles, but they seemed to stop suddenly at the point where the land dropped off into a steep ravine. There, he found something else. Half buried in the earth, just at the edge of the drop, were several strange objects. These objects, though long weathered, appeared to be human-made, but they were not anything John had ever seen before. They resembled old tools, roughly carved stones and pieces of what looked like bone, but their markings were unlike anything from the frontier or from the indigenous tribes in the area. Frightened by what he had uncovered, John returned to the cabin and told his wife Mary what he had found. But his curiosity, though shaken by the strange discovery, pushed him to seek out more answers. Over the next few weeks, he continued his searches, uncovering more fragments of what he could only describe as artifacts scattered along the river's edge. They were always just out of place enough to make him feel uneasy, yet still not enough to draw a clear conclusion. Around the same time, John began hearing from his neighbors in the nearby settlements. Some told him they had been hearing strange sounds too, loud, unsettling howls from the river's direction, accompanied by flashes of lights that could have been either fire or something else entirely. Others spoke of vague shapes seen along the edge of the trees, figures that moved with an odd, jerking gait, almost as if they were trying to remain hidden from view. John began to feel the weight of the past pressing on him, as if the land itself had a story to tell, one that stretched beyond his own arrival, beyond even the first settlers of Cedar Bluff. In one particularly haunting conversation with a local historian, the name Elias Markham surfaced once again. The historian, a man named Albert Lyle, who had been a boy when the events unfolded, shared with John a chilling recollection of his own. According to Lyle, there were old stories passed down from the native tribes, stories about something far older than the settlers, something that had lived along the river long before they arrived. "Some things don't leave," Lyle had said with a grim look, "and sometimes they come back for reasons we're not meant to understand." As the months passed, John's unease deepened. He could no longer ignore the strange occurrences surrounding his family's homestead. By the fall of 1883, he began to feel the weight of the area's history in his bones. His wife, Mary, too, became unsettled. She spoke less and less about the land, often choosing to stay inside after dusk, her eyes often drawn toward the darkening river. Then one morning John made a discovery that would forever change his perception of the land. Near the same spot where Markham's body had been found, he stumbled upon what appeared to be a burial site. The soil had been disturbed recently, and there were signs of digging. As he carefully examined the area, he uncovered a small wooden box, worn by time but still intact. Inside the box were several items, small tokens, mostly carved stones and fragments of bone, similar to those he had found earlier, but these were different. The markings on them were more intricate, more deliberate, as if they were part of some larger, hidden language. Shaken, John returned to the cabin and locked the box away, determined not to speak of it to anyone. But it was too late. The strange occurrences, the unsettling memories of Markham's death, had already embedded themselves too deeply into the land's story. John began to feel as if the past had reached out and claimed him, just as it had claimed those before him. The winter of 1883 brought a biting cold to the Missouri River region, settling heavily upon the land, its frost creeping deep into the soil. The Albright family's homestead, now firmly established but haunted by unsettling memories, became a quiet refuge. Yet the silence was only skin deep, for the river, as it always had, continued to shape the lives of those who dared to live near it. The strange noises that had troubled John earlier in the year seemed to lessen, but the uneasy atmosphere remained, ever present like the shadow of something too ancient to understand. John Albright, however, could not shake the feeling that the land was not done with him. He spent long hours after nightfall in his study, poring over the strange artifacts he had unearthed. In his growing isolation, his thoughts became consumed by a gnawing obsession. He began to wonder if the disturbed soil near the riverbank, the site where he had found the buried box, had more significance than he first realized. Was it possible that the markings on the stones were more than just symbols? Could they represent something that had been lost to time? One evening, while examining the markings under the flickering candlelight, he made a chilling discovery. The symbols on the carved bones and stones, though cryptic, began to resemble something more structured, almost like a language, but not just any language, one that John couldn't place. It was unlike any known script he had ever encountered, even in the history books he had read. The shapes seemed almost primal, as though they had been crafted by hands long removed from civilization. His obsession with the markings led him to revisit the burial site. This time, he wasn't alone. With him was Samuel Creel, a neighbor who had helped John earlier with some of his searches. The two men ventured out one evening after supper, walking quietly under the heavy moonlight. The air was thick with the sharp scent of pine and earth, and the river, now frozen over in places, glistened with an eerie stillness. The night felt different, charged, as if the land itself was holding its breath. When they reached the disturbed patch of earth, John immediately noticed something new: the tracks. The prints, larger than any animal were still present, but they were different this time. They had been partially covered by the falling snow, yet they stretched further than before, deeper into the woods and toward the river. They didn't just lead to the water's edge as they had before. They seemed to circle back around, as though something was moving in a strange pattern, perhaps even observing them. A strange hum, low and almost imperceptible, filled the air. It wasn't the usual wind or the shifting of trees. It was something else, something that seemed to come from the ground itself. Both men paused, their eyes scanning the darkness, but they saw nothing, nothing but the haunting outlines of the trees and the river's frozen expanse stretching far into the night. Then Creel heard it, a whisper, faint but unmistakable, coming from deeper within the woods. "Come closer," it seemed to beckon, though there was no clear voice, just a presence. His breath caught in his throat and he turned to John, his eyes wide with fear. "What is that?" Creel asked, his voice trembling. John didn't answer immediately. His own nerves were fraying, and for a moment he considered turning back, but something about the situation held him in place. The hum seemed to draw him forward, urging him to take one more step into the unknown. "Let's just see," John muttered, as if convincing himself more than Creel. With a sense of trepidation, the two men ventured further into the woods, following the strange, almost unnatural trail. The deeper they went, the colder the air became, the night growing unnervingly quiet around them. The only sound was the crunch of snow beneath their boots and the distant, muffled rumble of the frozen river. After what felt like hours, they reached the base of a ridge, where the tracks finally stopped. The snow had been disturbed here too, but the earth beneath was solid and unyielding. A large, flat stone sat at the center of a clearing, unlike any rock John had ever seen. It was perfectly smooth, almost too smooth, as though it had been shaped by hands other than nature's. As they circled it, they noticed the stone was covered in more of the strange symbols that seemed to pulse faintly under the light of the lantern. It was then that they heard the sound again, closer this time, like a whisper carried on the wind. But this time it was no longer a mere hum. The voice was clear now, low, guttural, and unmistakable. "Leave this place." The voice seemed to come from all around them, but there was no one in sight. Both men froze, their hearts racing, and for a long, uncomfortable moment, neither dared to move. Then, in a sudden rush, they turned and fled, the sound of their footsteps swallowed by the snow as they made their way back to the cabin. That night neither man slept. John lay awake, staring at the ceiling of his small cabin, while Creel sat by the fire, his eyes darting nervously toward the door. Both were shaken, but neither spoke of the experience until several days later. When they finally did, it was only in hushed tones. They spoke of the stone, the symbols, and the chilling voice that had followed them through the woods. But the more they spoke, the more they realized that no one would believe them, not truly. The story of Elias Markham, the whispers of strange creatures, the unease that had settled over Cedar Bluff, these things were fading from memory. But in their hearts, they both knew something more had happened, and the land, it seemed, was not yet done with its secrets. As winter gave way to spring in 1884, the land around Cedar Bluff began to show signs of life once again. The riverside thawed, the trees budded, and the wildflowers began to emerge from beneath the lingering frost. But for John Albright and his family, the change in seasons brought no relief from the tension that had taken root in their lives. The strange events of the past months had become an unspoken presence in their home, a shadow that lingered even in the brightest hours of the day. John's nights were filled with uneasy dreams, visions of figures, half human, half animal, walking through the trees, their glowing eyes fixated on him. He would wake in a cold sweat, his heart racing, only to be met by the stillness of his cabin and the familiar sounds of the river rushing outside. But it was the eerie whispering that continued to haunt him, the voice he and Creel had both heard, drifting from the depths of the woods like a warning that would not be ignored. The Albrights had considered leaving Cedar Bluff, but with the onset of spring, John felt the pull of his land more deeply. His resolve to stay, to uncover the truth behind the haunting presence that had taken hold of the area, grew stronger. He could not leave with so many questions unanswered, questions that tugged at him from every corner of the land. John's determination led him to visit Albert Lyle, the local historian who had spoken cryptically of the old stories and the mysterious forces said to haunt the river. Lyle had been a boy during the time of Markham's death, and though he was now an elderly man, his memories of the event remained vivid. When John arrived at Lyle's small cottage, the old historian welcomed him inside with a weary smile. "Well, well, John Albright," Lyle said, motioning for him to sit. "I see you've come seeking more answers. The land does not easily release its secrets, does it?" John nodded, his face grim. "I need to know more, about Markham, about the land, and about what we've been hearing." Lyle's eyes darkened, and for a long moment he stared into the crackling fire, his hands folded in his lap. "You've felt it, haven't you?" he asked softly. "That pull, the weight of something ancient. It's been here for a long time, even before the first settlers came." "What?" John leaned forward. "What do you mean, what's been here?" Lyle exhaled slowly, as if preparing to speak words long buried. "The Missouri River is old, older than we can imagine, and in its depths, well, some say there are things that live there, things that have always been there, things that belong to a time before men walked these shores. You see, there's a legend, one that dates back to the indigenous tribes who lived here long before we arrived." John listened intently as Lyle continued, his voice low and steady. "They spoke of a creature, a being of the river, a thing that was part man, part beast, and all spirit. It was said to be a guardian of sorts, watching over the land and the water, keeping balance. But in some stories it's also a curse, a punishment for those who disturb the land's natural order. And when Markham came to this place, when he began hunting those bears, he unknowingly disturbed that balance." John's mind raced. But how does this relate to Markham's death? Lyle's gaze turned distant, his words tinged with a sorrowful reverence. "The creature, or whatever it is, only reveals itself when the land is at its most unsettled. And Markham, he was a man who understood the wilderness, but he wasn't ready for this kind of thing. It wasn't a bear that killed him, it was something else entirely, something that's been waiting." John felt a chill crawl up his spine as the weight of Lyle's words settled in. Could it be true? Could the strange events, the tracks, and the whispers have been tied to something older, something beyond understanding? The historian's voice broke through his thoughts. "And the symbols you found, they are part of this. They're not just marks, they're warnings. Warnings that you've crossed into something you don't fully comprehend." That evening, John left Lyle's cottage with more questions than answers, his mind churning with the implications of what he had heard. The old man's words echoed in his mind. The river has its own guardian, its own protector, and it will not let go of what belongs to it. In the weeks that followed, John became more reclusive, spending his days by the river, searching for more signs, more clues. He could no longer shake the feeling that the land itself was watching him, waiting for him to understand its ancient language. But the more he searched, the more he realized that the answers he sought were not so easily uncovered. One evening, after a particularly long day spent along the riverbank, John returned to the cabin, exhausted and frustrated. As he sat down to rest, he heard something faint but unmistakable, the sound of soft footsteps behind him. He turned quickly, but there was no one there. The door to the cabin was still closed, and the silence that followed felt suffocating. He felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up as he listened, straining to hear any sound that might explain the footsteps, but there was nothing. For a long moment he sat frozen in place, his mind racing. Had he imagined it? Was the land playing tricks on him, or was something else, something older and more powerful, moving just beyond his reach? It was then that the wind picked up, carrying with it the faintest whisper, just audible above the rustling trees. "Leave this place." John froze, his breath catching in his throat. The voice was unmistakable, the same voice he had heard with Creel. It was closer now, as if it were standing just outside the cabin. But when he dared to look, there was nothing there, nothing but the wind and the silence. The haunting had returned. The events of that night marked a turning point for John Albright. The voice, the footsteps, the eerie sense of being watched, everything he had encountered thus far seemed to escalate. It was as if the land itself, or something that inhabited it, was pulling him deeper into a mystery he could neither fully understand nor escape. The boundaries between the natural and the supernatural seemed to blur with each passing day, and John found himself questioning his own sanity. As days stretched into weeks, he began to notice even stranger occurrences around the cabin. The animals in the area, once lively and active, had begun to disappear, and the forest around him felt unusually still, as though life had been drained from it. The birds no longer sang in the early mornings, and the howls of wolves that had once echoed through the woods were now absent. Even the river seemed to quiet, its rushing waters subdued, as if reluctant to disturb the unnatural silence that had settled over the land. In late May, after another sleepless night, John resolved to take action. The whispers, the strange markings, the unease, it all pointed to something far greater than a simple animal attack or local superstition. He had to know what had truly happened to Elias Markham and what had been haunting the land since. With determination set in his mind, John gathered a group of men from the neighboring settlements. Samuel Creel, still deeply shaken by the events of the previous year, agreed to join him, along with two others, Benjamin Ross, a farmer who had lived in the area for years, and Elias' old friend, Arthur Holloway, who had been one of the first to search for Markham all those months ago. The plan was simple. They would retrace Markham's steps, from the point where he had last been seen to the place where his body was discovered. The idea was to search the woods thoroughly, to uncover any further evidence of what had happened. But as they ventured into the wilderness, each man could feel the weight of the land pressing down upon them, each footstep feeling heavier than the last. As they followed the trail Markham had left behind, the air grew thick with tension. The forest seemed to close in around them, the trees now appearing gnarled and twisted, as though they had grown deformed by the land's strange energy. They reached Bear Hollow, a place Markham had spoken of in hushed tones, and where he had supposedly last tracked a large bear before his disappearance. The area was eerily quiet, save for the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. They stopped at the clearing where Markham had set up camp, and as they began to search the area, Creel's voice broke the silence. "Look here," he said, kneeling beside a patch of disturbed earth. The others gathered around, and they saw what Creel had found, another set of footprints, much like the ones Markham had left behind before his death. They were large, with deep indentations that seemed to stretch for miles. But this time they were fresher, new tracks made only hours before. John's heart pounded in his chest as he crouched beside the prints. The earth around them had been disturbed as though someone had been pacing in circles. There were no animal tracks in sight, no sign of wildlife. The prints, unmistakably human-like, led deeper into the forest, and yet there was something strange about them. They didn't look like the tracks of a man at all. Instead, they appeared as though they had been made by something with far larger, more exaggerated feet, something not quite human. The group stood in uneasy silence, unsure of how to proceed. The sense of dread that hung over them was palpable. John could feel his pulse quicken, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. "We shouldn't be here," Benjamin Ross muttered under his breath, his face pale. "This place, it feels wrong." But John, driven by the need for answers, motioned for the group to continue. "We need to find out what's at the heart of this. We can't leave without understanding what's happening here." Reluctantly, the men followed John as he led the way deeper into the woods. The air grew colder and the trees seemed to close in around them, their twisted branches reaching toward the sky like skeletal hands. It was then that they saw it, a large, flat stone, just like the one John had discovered months earlier near the riverbank. This one, however, was different. It was much larger, almost the size of a small house, and it was covered in strange symbols just as John had seen before. The symbols were not like any known language, but there was a familiarity to them, as though they were part of a larger pattern, a message waiting to be deciphered. As John examined the stone, he noticed that there were more markings than before, as if someone, or something, had been adding to them over the years. It was then that the whispering began again. At first it was faint, a low murmur in the distance, but it grew louder with each passing second until it seemed to come from every direction. The voice, guttural and unsettling, filled the air and the men froze in place, their eyes wide with fear. "Leave this place. Leave now." The words were unmistakable and they seemed to echo off the stone, reverberating through the trees. The wind picked up, howling through the clearing, and the men looked around in panic. But no matter how hard they searched, they saw no one, nothing but the oppressive silence and the strange, unnatural symbols on the stone. John's heart raced as he turned to his companions. "We need to leave. Now." But as they turned to head back, the ground beneath their feet seemed to shift, as though the very earth was moving. The men stumbled, and a low growl rumbled from somewhere deep in the woods. A shadow moved among the trees, a large, hulking figure, its glowing eyes piercing through the darkness. "Run!" John shouted as the figure moved closer, its form shifting and changing, impossible to fully comprehend. The men sprinted back toward the settlement, but no matter how fast they ran, the presence in the woods seemed to follow them, never far behind. By the time they reached the cabin, they were breathless and terrified, their hearts pounding in their chests. That night, as the wind howled outside, John sat by the fire, his mind racing. What had they seen in the woods? Was it the creature Lyle had spoken of, the guardian of the river? Or was it something far worse, something far older than any of them could understand? One thing was certain: the land of Cedar Bluff had its secrets, and they were not ready to let go. The events of that night marked the beginning of John Albright's unraveling. The terror that had overtaken him and his companions in the woods seemed to sink deeper into his bones with each passing day. As the weeks wore on, the unease that had once been a quiet presence now manifested itself in every corner of his life. His sleep was fitful, his thoughts consumed by what he had seen in the woods, and the more he tried to make sense of it, the more he realized that there were no answers to be found. By June of 1884, John had become a man almost undone by the weight of his own discovery. The Albright family had all but retreated into the safety of the cabin, with John becoming increasingly distant and preoccupied. His wife, Mary, had grown fearful of the changes in her husband. She saw the hollowness in his eyes, the weariness that came from his endless searching and questioning. And though she tried to support him, she too had begun to feel the pull of the land, the creeping unease that had once been only whispered about by the older residents of the area. The settlers in the surrounding regions, those who had once been in awe of Cedar Bluff's potential, began to leave. Rumors spread of strange sightings, of figures seen at the edge of the woods, of unnatural sounds echoing across the river at night. Cedar Bluff, once a bustling outpost, now seemed to exist only in the collective memory of those who had once called it home. No one wanted to stay, and no one dared venture near the river after sunset. As the final settlers packed up their belongings and moved away, John was left with an overwhelming sense of abandonment. His search for the truth, it seemed, had become a lonely pursuit. Only Creel remained by his side, but even he had begun to show signs of weariness. The two men, once determined to uncover whatever secrets the land held, now found themselves at odds, their once shared resolve giving way to a more somber acceptance of the unknown. It was during one of their final conversations late in the summer that Creel spoke words that John had been avoiding. "You've seen it, John," Creel said quietly as they sat on the porch of the cabin, the air thick with the evening fog. "We've all seen it, and it's not just the land. There's something else here, something that won't let go. I think it's time we leave." John didn't answer right away. He sat in silence, staring out at the river as the water flowed silently beneath the darkening sky. He had long been aware of the growing toll on both his body and mind. But despite the fear, the sense of danger, there was something else, a nagging feeling that kept him tethered to this cursed place. He couldn't explain it, but he knew deep down that his work here was not yet finished. "We've uncovered something, Creel," John said at last, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what it is, but we're not the first ones to come here. Markham wasn't the first. Whoever came before him, they left something behind. This land, this river, it's not like any place we've known." What? Creel's eyes darkened as he listened, and for the first time, John saw a flicker of fear cross his face. "I don't want to know what's here anymore, John. Some things shouldn't be dug up. Some things shouldn't be uncovered. The land has taken too much already." John paused, a strange determination settling in his chest. "I'm not leaving, Creel, not yet. There's something more here, I can feel it." The conversation ended there, but the tension between the two men had reached its breaking point. Creel's departure from Cedar Bluff was inevitable, and soon after their exchange he left, seeking refuge in the nearest town, leaving John alone with his obsession. For the next several months, John's search grew even more frantic. He spent his days combing the woods near Bear Hollow and the riverbank, each step taking him deeper into the mystery that had been handed to him. He examined every scrap of evidence he could find, pieces of bone, broken tools, and strange markings, each item leading him further into the labyrinth of secrets the land held. It was in late fall, as the days grew shorter and the nights colder, that John stumbled upon a discovery that would change everything. He had been following the same trail he had tracked months before, near the same disturbed soil by the river, when he noticed something new, a small, weathered journal, half buried in the ground. The pages, though worn, were still legible, and as John carefully flipped through them, he realized that they were written by none other than Elias Markham himself. The journal chronicled Markham's final days in Cedar Bluff, and it was here that John found something that sent a chill through his entire being. Markham had written about his encounters with something strange, something he described as a guardian spirit of the land, a being that watched over the river and the woods. The journal spoke of encounters with shadows that moved with unnatural grace, of voices that called from the darkness, and of dreams that were not entirely dreams, visions of creatures that walked in both the world of men and the world of beasts. Markham's final entry was the most disturbing. In it, he wrote that he had encountered something at the riverbank, a creature, something not entirely human but not entirely animal either. He described it as a half-man, half-beast with eyes that glowed like embers in the dark. The creature had spoken to him, warning him to leave, but Markham, driven by his own pride and curiosity, refused. "They will not let me leave," Markham had written, "and I fear I am too late. The river holds them, and they will claim me just as they claimed the others." John's hands trembled as he read the final lines. He had no doubt now that the creature Markham had encountered was the same one that had haunted his own nights, the one that had whispered to him and Creel in the woods. It was a creature of the river, a guardian of the land, and it would not allow any to uncover its secrets. With this final piece of the puzzle in place, John realized that his search for answers had come at a terrible cost. He had uncovered the truth, but it was a truth that was far more dangerous than he had ever imagined. The river, it seemed, was not just a body of water. It was a barrier, a threshold between two worlds, and those who disturbed it would never be allowed to leave. The discovery of Elias Markham's journal marked the final stage in John Albright's descent into the mystery that had consumed him for over a year. Though the words on the pages confirmed the existence of something ancient and terrible, they also left John with an unsettling realization. The land and the river were more than just a backdrop to the stories of settlers. They were a living entity, a boundary between worlds, and the forces that had claimed Markham's life had been watching him all along. The journal's revelation, that Markham had been warned by the very creature John had encountered in the woods, sent a wave of dread through John. He had thought that by uncovering the truth, he could break free of the land's grip, but the more he learned, the more he realized he was being drawn deeper into the river's curse. The whispers, the strange figures in the woods, the unexplainable sounds, all of it pointed to something far beyond human understanding. For weeks, John spent his nights reading Markham's journal over and over, trying to make sense of the cryptic entries. There were passages that spoke of the land's history, of the creatures that had once roamed the Missouri River before the settlers arrived. Markham had written that the guardians of the river were not mere animals, but beings that existed in a state between the physical world and the spirit realm. They were protectors, but not of the settlers. They were protectors of the land itself. The journal also spoke of the boundaries between worlds being fragile. Markham had mentioned the veil between the realms growing thinner with each passing year. And now, John understood that the settlers' presence in Cedar Bluff had disturbed that balance. The land, the river, and the creatures who inhabited it had been dormant for centuries, but the arrival of humans, the cutting of trees, the building of homes, all of it had disturbed something ancient, something that had been lying in wait. John's obsession only deepened as the weeks went by. He spent days and nights walking the land, following the same trails Markham had once followed. But each time he ventured near the riverbank or Bear Hollow, he felt the oppressive presence of the creature watching him. There were moments when he felt as though the land itself was alive, breathing, moving beneath his feet. One evening, as the last remnants of daylight vanished behind the trees, John stood by the river once again, the wind tugging at his coat. The water flowed quietly beneath him, but he could sense something just beneath the surface, something waiting. It was then that he heard the sound he had hoped never to hear again, the deep, guttural growl coming from the dark trees beyond the river. His heart raced, and for a moment he froze. The growl grew louder, the sound of something moving through the underbrush, heavy and deliberate. John's instincts screamed at him to run, to turn and flee, but something held him in place. He had come this far, and now he had no choice but to face whatever lay in the depths of the river. He called out into the night, his voice trembling, "I know you're here. I know what you are." For a long moment there was only silence, but then the growl returned, closer this time. And then something shifted in the trees. A figure, large and hulking, emerged from the shadows, its eyes glowing faintly in the dark. John's breath caught in his throat as the creature stepped into the clearing. It was as Markham had described, half human, half beast. Its form was twisted, its body covered in ragged fur, but there was something otherworldly about it, as if it didn't quite belong to this world. The creature stood tall, its features both human and monstrous, a grotesque fusion of the two. And then, as it stepped closer, John saw the eyes amber, glowing like burning coals, and in them he saw something he had not expected: intelligence, malice, and something far older than he could comprehend. "You were warned," the creature's voice came, not from its mouth but from the air itself. The voice was deep, resonant, and it seemed to vibrate in John's chest. "You do not belong here." John's heart pounded in his ears as he struggled to speak. I just wanted to understand. I didn't mean to disturb you." The creature tilted its head, as if considering John's words. "The land is not yours to understand. It is ours to protect." John took a step back, his mind racing. This was it, the moment he had dreaded. The creature was not just a guardian of the river, but something far more powerful. It had been waiting, watching, and now it had claimed him. Before he could react, the creature lunged forward, its movements fast and unnervingly graceful. John stumbled backward, his legs shaking as the creature's presence overwhelmed him. But as it reached for him, something strange happened. The world around him seemed to warp, as though the very air was bending, pulling him away from the creature's grasp. In that moment, everything stopped. John found himself standing in the clearing, but the creature was gone. The growl had faded into the night, and the oppressive feeling that had weighed on him for so long seemed to lift. He was alone again, his heart still racing, but the silence that followed was absolute. It was as if the land had exhaled, releasing the tension that had built up over the past year. But something had changed. As John turned to leave the clearing, he heard it again, the voice, faint but clear, whispering in his mind. "You will not leave. No one does." John's blood ran cold as he realized the truth of what the creature had said. Cedar Bluff, the land, and the river, it was all connected, a force greater than any of them had understood. And once you crossed the boundary, there was no turning back. With the realization settling like a stone in his chest, John began the long walk back to the cabin. He knew now that the creature's warning was not just for him, but for everyone who had ever set foot on this land. There was no escaping it. The river had claimed them all, and Cedar Bluff would remain its eternal guardian. As the days passed, John's mind grew heavy with the weight of what he had learned. The creature's warning echoed in his thoughts, and the more he pondered it, the more it seemed to grow in significance. He had not been the first to encounter the guardians of the river, and he certainly wouldn't be the last. Those who came to the land, whether out of curiosity or necessity, would always find themselves drawn into the same fate. Markham had discovered that truth too late, and now, John realized, he had become part of that same cycle. The land around Cedar Bluff felt different now. The once familiar woods that John had wandered through for months now seemed foreign to him. The trees were no longer just trees. They were silent sentinels, watching him from the shadows. The river, too, had taken on a more ominous presence. The water flowed as it always had, but now every ripple, every movement seemed to conceal something far darker beneath its surface. It was as if the land itself was alive, and it was aware of him. John had tried to leave the cabin, to walk away from the river and the haunting that had consumed him, but each time he stepped outside, he felt the pull again. The pull of the land, the pull of the river. He couldn't escape it. The creature had been right. No one who had crossed that boundary could ever truly leave. As the seasons shifted, the landscape around Cedar Bluff grew more desolate. The few remaining settlers had long since abandoned their homes, leaving John as the last soul in the area. The land, now empty and devoid of human life, seemed to sink deeper into its eerie silence. The days grew colder and the nights longer as winter crept in. John's isolation, once something he had sought, now became unbearable. The air felt thick with an unseen presence, a presence that grew stronger with each passing day. One cold morning, just as the sun began to rise over the river, John ventured out once more. His breath was visible in the air, a constant reminder of the cold that had settled in the land. He had resolved to find some final answers, to face the creature once more, and perhaps even to uncover the truth behind the guardian of the river. It was the only way he could come to terms with what had happened, to face the source of the terror that had held him captive for so long. As he walked toward the riverbank, his footsteps crunching in the snow, John's thoughts were a blur. He was no longer sure of what he was searching for, whether it was redemption, an end to the haunting, or simply an escape from the never-ending whispers in his mind. He only knew that he could not remain in the cabin, trapped by the very land he had once sought to understand. When he reached the water's edge, John stopped, gazing out at the dark, flowing river. The sky above was overcast, and the wind carried a biting chill that stung his skin. The river was still, but the same oppressive silence weighed heavily upon him. There was no sound except for the wind and the distant rustle of trees. Then, just as he began to turn and walk away, a voice spoke, so faint and yet so clear that it seemed to come from the very depths of the river itself. "You are here." John froze, his heart hammering in his chest. The voice was the same as before, the low, guttural whisper that had haunted him for so long. It wasn't a sound in the air, but a sensation in his mind, a presence that wrapped around his thoughts, pulling him back to the river. "I've come for answers," John said, his voice barely above a whisper. The water rippled, and then, slowly, a shape began to emerge from the river. It was the same creature he had seen before, its massive form rising from the depths, its eyes glowing with that same eerie light. The creature moved with unsettling grace, its large, hulking body half human, half beast, and yet it was something more, something that defied description. John stood frozen, his breath caught in his throat as the creature's gaze locked onto his. The river seemed to swirl around it, as if the very water was alive, responding to its presence. The creature's mouth opened, but it did not speak. Instead, a low, rumbling sound filled the air, and John's mind seemed to crack open, flooded with visions of ancient times, times when the river had been a place of power, a place where the veil between worlds had been thin and where beings like the creature had roamed freely. The vision passed as quickly as it had come, leaving John breathless and disoriented. When he regained his senses, the creature was still there, looming before him. It did not approach, but simply watched, its eyes burning with an ancient knowledge. "You have seen what we are," the creature finally spoke, its voice deep and resonant. "But you will never understand. The land is ours, and those who disturb it are bound to its will. You were warned, but still you sought to uncover its secrets." John swallowed hard, his voice trembling as he spoke. "What happens now? What will become of me?" The creature's gaze softened, just for a moment, as if contemplating something long forgotten. "What happens now is the same as what has happened before. You will remain here, bound to the river and the land. Your fate is sealed, as was Markham's, as will be the fate of anyone who dares to trespass upon this sacred ground." John's heart sank. He knew now that he was trapped in the same way Markham had been, in the same way the settlers before him had been. There was no escape. The river, the land, the creature, it all held him, and he would never be free. The creature turned and began to retreat back into the river, its massive form disappearing into the water with an unnatural grace. The river flowed silently once more, the oppressive stillness returning as if nothing had happened at all. John stood there for a long time, his mind reeling. The creature had spoken the truth. There was no escape. He was a part of the land now, bound to it, just as Markham had been before him. And like all who had come before him, he would be lost to the river's guardians, forever caught in the cycle that had claimed so many others. As the days passed, John's sense of isolation grew. He spent more and more time by the river, watching its waters flow endlessly, knowing that he was no different from the others who had vanished into its depths. Cedar Bluff, once a place of potential and promise, had become his prison, and the river, with its ancient, watchful guardians, would never release him. Winter deepened, casting its long, cold fingers over the land. The once familiar world of Cedar Bluff now seemed like a distant memory. John Albright, a man who had once sought to uncover the mysteries of the land, had become one with it, a prisoner bound by the very secrets he had sought to reveal. The days blurred together, each one a reflection of the last, each moment filled with the oppressive silence of the river and the weight of the creature's warning. As the river continued its endless flow, John's connection to it deepened. He no longer walked with the same sense of purpose that he had once carried, the drive to understand the land and its secrets now replaced with a deep resignation. The land had claimed him as it had claimed Markham, and as it would claim anyone else who dared to uncover its truths. Cedar Bluff was no longer a settlement. It was a tomb, its quiet streets and abandoned homes serving as a reminder of the past, of those who had come and gone, lost to the land's unyielding grasp. John's thoughts, once consumed by the idea of uncovering the land's mysteries, had now shifted. The pull of the river was stronger than ever. It whispered to him in the night, in the rustle of the trees, in the distant sound of the water rushing over stones. He had come to understand the river's language, the rhythm of its flow, and the power that lay hidden beneath its surface. But it was not just the river that called to him. The land itself had begun to change. The trees, once so familiar, now seemed to loom over him, their gnarled branches reaching toward the sky like skeletal arms. The air was thick with an ancient presence, a weight that John could not escape, no matter how far he ventured into the woods. The creatures of the forest, once distant figures in the background, now seemed to move closer, watching him with eyes that were too knowing, too ancient. One evening, just as the sun dipped below the horizon and the chill of night settled over the land, John stood once again by the river. He had come to realize that there was no escaping this place, No escape from the land's pull, from the creature that guarded it, from the curse that had claimed Markham and so many others. The river had consumed them all, and now it would consume him. As John stood by the water's edge, he felt a shift in the air. The wind picked up, rustling the trees, and the familiar low hum filled the space around him, the same hum he had heard before. The creature's presence was close, but this time there was something different. The air was charged, and John could feel it, as though the very fabric of the land itself was trembling. "Are you ready?" The voice came, not from the creature itself, but from the wind, from the water, from the very earth beneath John's feet. John closed his eyes and took a deep breath. He knew what was coming. He had known for a long time. The creature's warning, the whispers in the woods, the pull of the river, it had all been leading to this moment. He had no choice but to face it, to surrender to the land that had claimed him. "I am ready," he whispered, his voice barely audible against the rising wind. The water surged, rising higher than it should have, the current stronger, more violent. The river seemed to awaken, its surface swirling with an energy that John had never felt before. The creature appeared, its massive form emerging from the depths of the river, its glowing eyes fixed on him. But this time there was no fear in John. There was no terror, no struggle. There was only an acceptance, a quiet resignation to the fact that this was his fate, just as it had been Markham's, just as it had been for every other soul who had walked the land and sought its secrets. "You have been chosen," the creature said, its voice resonating through John's mind. "You belong to the river now. You are part of this land, part of the Guardian's legacy." John stepped forward, his body moving with an unfamiliar fluidity, as though the river's currents were pulling him, guiding him toward the creature. He felt the cold water rise around him, enveloping him as if the river itself was embracing him. "Do not fight it," the creature's voice urged. "Embrace what you are becoming." John's eyes, once filled with fear and confusion, now held a quiet understanding. He had come to realize that the land, the river, the creature, it was all one. It was a cycle, a force that had existed long before settlers arrived and would continue long after they were gone. There was no escaping it, no resisting it. The land had claimed him, and he was now a part of its eternal rhythm. As the water closed around him, John felt his body shift, felt himself becoming one with the river, his form melding with the land in a way he could not describe. He was not a man anymore, nor was he entirely a creature. He was something between, something timeless, something that belonged to the river, to the land, to the guardians. The last thing John saw before the water swallowed him completely was the creature's eyes, glowing with an ancient light, watching him with a quiet, knowing gaze. It was the same gaze Markham had seen, the same gaze that had claimed so many before him. And then silence. The river flowed on as it always had, its currents carrying John's soul deeper into its depths. Cedar Bluff, the settlement that had once known life, was now a forgotten memory, its buildings crumbling, its people long gone. But the land remained, the river remained, and the guardians, those ancient beings, half man, half beast, remained, watching, waiting for the next soul to stumble upon their cursed shores. The cycle would continue, and the river would claim them all. Years passed, and the legend of Cedar Bluff faded into the pages of forgotten history. The land, once vibrant with the lives of settlers and the promise of a thriving community, had been reclaimed by the wilderness. The abandoned cabins, now weathered and decayed, stood like broken skeletons of a time long past. The river, ever flowing, continued its ceaseless path through the land, indifferent to the passage of time. But though Cedar Bluff had become a ghost town, its story had not been completely forgotten. In nearby settlements, there were still those who spoke of the strange happenings at the river's edge, of the people who had vanished without a trace, of the voices that seemed to call from the woods, and of the eerie, glowing eyes that had been seen on the horizon, watching, waiting. One such place was the town of Riverton, a small community several miles downriver from the remains of Cedar Bluff. Riverton had once been a bustling hub for fur traders and travelers, but by the late 1890s, it too had begun to show signs of the land's inexorable pull. The settlers here were wary of the river, wary of the woods, and most kept their distance from the area that had once been Cedar Bluff. But the legend of the guardian spirit of the river lived on, passed down through whispered stories and old journals. It was in Riverton that a curious scholar named Dr. Henry Bradford, a historian with an obsession for the obscure, began to take an interest in the tale. Dr. Bradford had heard the rumors of the strange disappearances, the haunting whispers, and the creature that roamed the woods near Cedar Bluff. He was fascinated by the history of the area, and more than anything, was drawn to the idea of a creature that was both human and beast, a guardian of the land. He saw it as an opportunity to study the folklore and perhaps uncover the truth behind the mysterious events. In the winter of 1897, Dr. Bradford set out for Cedar Bluff, determined to unravel the mystery that had intrigued him for so long. Armed with notebooks, a camera, and a curiosity that bordered on obsession, he arrived in the ruins of the town, seeking answers. The air was cold, and a light snow began to fall as he walked through the decaying streets of what had once been a thriving settlement. The silence was unnerving, broken only by the soft crunch of snow beneath his boots. Dr. Bradford's first impression of the area was one of overwhelming desolation. The buildings, now little more than skeletons of wood and stone, seemed to sag under the weight of time. The land around Cedar Bluff had begun to reclaim what had once been settled. Grass and weeds grew wild, and the river, as always, flowed relentlessly by. Despite the eerie stillness, Dr. Bradford felt an odd sense of purpose. He set to work immediately, taking notes and sketching the area. His goal was simple: to piece together the history of Cedar Bluff, to understand why it had been abandoned, and to uncover the truth behind the mysterious disappearances. As he explored the remains of the settlement, he found little evidence of the people who had once lived there. There were no personal items, no family heirlooms, just the cold remnants of a forgotten town. It wasn't until the third day of his investigation that Dr. Bradford stumbled upon something that would change everything. While examining the riverbank near the old cabins, he noticed something strange: footprints, deep and large, leading from the water's edge into the woods. These were no ordinary tracks. They were too large to belong to any bear or man. They seemed almost otherworldly, as though they had been made by something not entirely of this world. Curious and unnerved, Dr. Bradford followed the tracks into the forest, his breath visible in the cold air. The further he ventured, the more the trees seemed to close in around him. The woods, once familiar and comforting to him, now felt oppressive, as though the very air was heavy with something unseen. He felt as though he were being watched, though whenever he turned there was nothing there. The tracks led him to the edge of a clearing, and there, in the center of it, he found a large stone, covered in strange symbols, much like the ones described in Markham's journal. It was the same kind of stone that John Albright had discovered years before, the one that had been a key to understanding the ancient power that guarded the river. Dr. Bradford's heart raced as he examined the symbols, realizing that they were part of a much larger language, a language that had been lost to time, a language that held the secrets of the land. He knelt beside the stone, running his fingers over the symbols, feeling a strange energy pulse beneath his fingertips. It was as though the stone was alive, as if it were connected to something far older, something that had been waiting for centuries. It was then that the air around him grew still. The wind ceased to blow, and the forest seemed to hold its breath. Dr. Bradford stood up quickly, sensing something was wrong. He turned, but before he could take a step, he felt a presence behind him, a presence that was not entirely human. He spun around, his heart pounding in his chest. Standing in the shadows of the trees was a figure, large and hulking, its eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. The creature, half human, half beast, stared at him, its eyes full of ancient knowledge and silent judgment. "You should not have come," the creature's voice echoed, not in the air but in Dr. Bradford's mind, as though it were a part of him, as though the land itself was speaking to him. "You have disturbed the balance. You have come too close to the truth." Dr. Bradford's mind raced, and in that moment he realized the terrible truth. He had come too far. The land, the river, the creature, it was all connected. The cycle was not over. It had never been over. The creature stepped forward, its form growing larger, more imposing, its eyes burning with an ancient, untamable rage. The river, too, seemed to stir, its currents churning violently as if in response to the creature's presence. "You will be the last," the creature spoke again, its voice like a low growl, "the last to seek the truth. For those who disturb the land will never leave. You will remain here as part of the river, as part of the cycle. And your story will be lost, just like the others." With that, the creature lunged forward, and Dr. Bradford's scream was swallowed by the wind. The forest returned to silence, the creature disappearing into the shadows as the river flowed on, eternal and unyielding. In the days following Dr. Bradford's disappearance, rumors began to spread through Riverton. At first, the townsfolk dismissed his absence as just another case of an overzealous scholar getting lost in the wilderness. After all, Cedar Bluff was little more than a set of crumbling ruins now, a place better left forgotten. But as the days turned into weeks and Dr. Bradford failed to return, the whispers grew louder, tinged with unease. Some spoke of the strange tracks that had been found near the river, of the large footprints that had led into the woods. Others recalled the eerie silence that had settled over the town just before Bradford had left, as though the land itself had known something was about to happen. And a few of the older residents, who had grown up hearing stories of the guardian of the river, began to wonder if the river had claimed another soul. Riverton's sheriff, a pragmatic man named Charles Montgomery, was the first to take action. He had heard the rumors, and though he wasn't one for superstition, he couldn't ignore the fact that a scholar had vanished without a trace in a place that had long been known for its mysterious disappearances. Montgomery assembled a small search party, including a few of the more experienced hunters in the area, and set out for Cedar Bluff. The journey was difficult, the road to Cedar Bluff now overgrown and barely passable. The forest, which had once been a place of beauty and peace, now felt oppressive. The air grew thick with an unnatural stillness, and the shadows of the trees seemed to stretch longer than they should have. As the search party neared the outskirts of Cedar Bluff, the temperature seemed to drop, the wind growing colder, sharper. They arrived at the riverbank just as dusk began to fall, the sky turning a deep shade of purple. The land was as desolate as ever, the remnants of the settlement now little more than a memory, its wooden structures long since eaten away by time and nature. The river flowed quietly, its surface barely disturbed by the occasional ripple. It seemed peaceful, yet there was an unmistakable sense of unease that hung over the place, a feeling that something was watching them from the shadows. Sheriff Montgomery led the group to the clearing where Dr. Bradford had last been seen. The ground was undisturbed, save for the faint marks of old footprints. They followed the trail into the woods, the trees growing denser as they moved deeper into the forest. The further they went, the more the air seemed to thicken, and the feeling of being watched grew stronger. The hunters, who had grown up in these woods, exchanged uneasy glances, but none dared to speak. It wasn't long before they stumbled upon the stone, the same one Dr. Bradford had found, the one covered in strange symbols. The markings were worn with time, but they were still visible, and the feeling of ancient power seemed to radiate from the stone. The group paused, the hairs on the back of their necks standing on end as they looked at the stone, then back at the woods around them. Sheriff Montgomery knelt beside the stone, his fingers brushing against the worn symbols. He had seen many things in his time as a sheriff, drunken brawls, stolen horses, and even the occasional murder, but nothing like this. The stone, the symbols, the eerie silence, it was all too strange, too unsettling. "There's something here," Montgomery muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. "Something we don't understand." The silence that followed seemed to deepen, and the wind began to pick up again, rustling the branches overhead. It was then that they heard it, the sound of something moving through the trees, heavy and deliberate. The hunters stiffened, their eyes darting to the shadows, but they saw nothing. The air felt charged, as though the land itself was holding its breath. "Stay alert," Montgomery commanded, his voice low. "We're not alone." As they continued deeper into the woods, the sounds grew louder, the feeling of being watched becoming more intense. And then at the edge of a clearing they saw it, the creature. It stood in the shadows, massive and hulking, its eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. The creature was unlike anything the men had ever seen, its form a grotesque blend of man and beast, covered in ragged fur. It was still, watching them with an intelligence that seemed to pierce through them, its gaze cold and calculating. For a moment none of them moved, caught in the creature's gaze, as if their bodies had frozen in place. The silence was broken by a low growl, a rumble that seemed to come from deep within the creature's chest. It took a step forward, its large feet crushing the earth beneath it, and then, in a voice that was both human and something far older, it spoke. "You should not have come," the creature intoned, its voice a low, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate through the ground beneath them. "The land has claimed this place, and those who disturb it are not meant to leave." Sheriff Montgomery's heart raced as the creature's words sank in. The legends, the stories, everything he had heard as a child, everything that had been passed down in hushed whispers was true. The river, the land, the creature, it was all connected, and it was all waiting for them. The men drew their weapons, but their hands were shaking, their confidence wavering in the face of something they couldn't understand. The creature stepped forward again, its eyes burning with an ancient fury, and for a moment it felt as though the very air was suffocating them, pressing in on them from all sides. "You will not leave," the creature repeated, its voice louder this time, filled with an undeniable power. "None of you will." Before they could react, the creature lunged forward, its massive form moving faster than any of them could comprehend. The men fired their weapons, but the shots seemed to have no effect. The creature continued its advance, its eyes glowing brighter, its growl reverberating through the forest. And then, with a deafening roar, it was upon them. The forest fell silent once more. The sounds of the struggle echoed through the forest like the cries of something primal, but just as quickly the forest swallowed them, silencing everything. The search party, Sheriff Montgomery, the hunters, and the few others who had come with him, had vanished as if they had never been there at all. Days passed before anyone came looking for them. The residents of Riverton, having heard nothing from Montgomery or his men, began to grow anxious. It was unlike the sheriff to stay away for long, especially with the growing fear that something might be amiss in the woods of Cedar Bluff. But no one was brave enough to venture back to the cursed settlement. Even the older folk, who had known the tales since they were children, refused to speak of it. It was only a young man named Jeremiah Lewis, who had recently moved to Riverton with his family, who dared to take matters into his own hands. Jeremiah had heard the stories, tales of Cedar Bluff's abandonment, of the strange deaths, of the unspoken terror that clung to the land. He was a stranger to Riverton, a newcomer with no ties to the old fears of the locals, and he dismissed their warnings as superstition. With the sheriff's absence and no word from the search party, Jeremiah resolved to discover what had happened. His curiosity was as much a curse as it was a blessing, for it drove him toward Cedar Bluff in search of answers. Armed with little more than his wits and a rifle, he set out on foot, determined to uncover the truth. The journey to Cedar Bluff took longer than he expected. The road was rough, overgrown with brambles, and the dense forest grew thicker as he approached the old settlement. By the time he reached the riverbank, the sun had long set, and the moon hung low in the sky, casting an eerie light over the landscape. Cedar Bluff was as desolate as he had imagined. The remnants of the once thriving settlement lay scattered in ruins, half buried beneath layers of time and nature's reclamation. Jeremiah wandered through the crumbling streets, the air thick with the scent of decay. It wasn't until he reached the outskirts of town that he began to feel the weight of the place, a heavy, oppressive presence that seemed to hang in the air, as if the land itself was watching him, waiting for him to make a mistake. Jeremiah pushed forward, his steps slow and deliberate, as though the very earth beneath him was trying to stop him from continuing. His fingers tightened around the rifle he carried, though he knew it would do little good against whatever was haunting this place. When he reached the riverbank, his heart skipped a beat. There, partially obscured by the darkness, was the same stone Dr. Bradford had found. It was more weathered now, its symbols barely visible, but it still radiated a strange energy that made his skin crawl. As he approached it, the air grew cold, the wind biting at his skin like a warning. The water of the river, usually so quiet, began to stir, the current picking up in a way that felt unnatural. Jeremiah stood before the stone, his breath catching in his throat as he touched it, running his fingers over the markings. The moment his skin made contact, the ground beneath him trembled and the whispering began. At first it was faint, a murmur in the distance, something just beyond his hearing. But then it grew louder, clearer, until it felt as though the very earth was speaking to him. "You should not have come," the voice said, not aloud but within his mind as though it were part of him. Jeremiah jerked back, his heart racing. The wind howled through the trees, and the surface of the river seemed to ripple, as though something just beneath the surface was stirring. Panic began to set in, but curiosity, stronger than his fear, urged him to stay. He turned back to the stone, his fingers trembling as he reached for it once more. Before he could touch it, the river surged, the current growing violent as though something was rising from the depths. The air became thick, suffocating, and the temperature dropped even further. And then, through the swirling mist and the darkness, he saw it, just as the others had seen it before him. The creature emerged from the river, its hulking form rising from the depths like a nightmare made flesh. Its glowing eyes locked onto Jeremiah, and for a moment, time seemed to freeze. The world around him felt distant, as though he were no longer part of it, just a spectator to a much older drama unfolding. "You have disturbed the land," the creature's voice rumbled in his mind, deep and unearthly. "You seek what should not be known." Jeremiah staggered back, his mind racing but his body frozen in place. The creature stepped forward, its massive feet sinking into the earth with a sound like the cracking of bones. Each step it took seemed to send a shudder through the ground, and Jeremiah could feel the weight of centuries pressing down on him. "What is this place?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Why are you here?" The creature paused, its eyes narrowing as if considering the question. "This place is a boundary, a threshold. It is neither part of the world you know, nor the one you cannot see, and those who disturb it must pay the price." Jeremiah's mind spun, trying to comprehend what was happening, but before he could process it, the creature was upon him. Its hand, large and clawed, shot out and gripped him by the chest, lifting him off the ground with terrifying ease. He gasped for air, but his lungs felt crushed under the weight of an invisible force. "You will join us," the creature intoned, its voice now more a command than a warning. The last thing Jeremiah saw before the world went black were the glowing eyes of the creature, watching him with an ancient, unyielding gaze. And then, as the creature's grip tightened, the river surged around him, and the land claimed another soul. The forest fell silent once more, and the river flowed on as it always had. Weeks passed before anyone in Riverton realized that Jeremiah Lewis had not returned. The young man had been eager to prove himself, to uncover the secrets of Cedar Bluff, but he had been swallowed up by the land, just as others before him had been. As the days turned to weeks, the people of Riverton grew more concerned, but none dared to venture back to the cursed settlement. Those who had once lived near Cedar Bluff knew better than to return to its ruins, to the river that seemed to call to those who came too close. The news of Jeremiah's disappearance eventually reached Dr. Bradford's family, who had been quietly waiting for word of the scholar's fate. They had received no letters, no signs that their loved one had made any progress on his research. And so, a decision was made. Dr. Bradford's brother, Edward, a pragmatic man with no belief in the supernatural, would travel to Cedar Bluff to bring his brother home, no matter what it took. Edward Bradford was a man of reason, a man who relied on facts and evidence to understand the world around him. He had never believed in the stories surrounding Cedar Bluff, stories of the guardian spirit of the cursed land, of the strange deaths that had plagued the town for years. But when he arrived in Riverton and heard the accounts of those who had known Dr. Bradford, he was left with little choice but to follow the same path his brother had taken. He would go to Cedar Bluff, find the truth, and return with his brother's body. That was all he could do. On a cold morning in late winter, Edward set out for the cursed town. He was not a man who was easily intimidated, but as he made his way toward the settlement, he began to feel the weight of the stories that had been passed down to him. The woods were dense, the road nearly impassable, and the closer he came to Cedar Bluff, the more oppressive the air became. The forest seemed to close in around him, and the wind carried with it a faint whisper that sent a chill down his spine. As he arrived at the outskirts of Cedar Bluff, Edward felt the temperature drop even further, the cold biting at his skin. The sight before him was not one he had expected. Cedar Bluff, once a bustling settlement, was now little more than a graveyard of broken buildings and decaying remnants. The town had been consumed by time and nature, leaving behind only the barest trace of what had once been. The wind howled through the empty streets, and Edward shivered as he walked toward the river. He had no intention of lingering in the town, but he knew that he had to find out what had happened to his brother. As he neared the riverbank, he stopped, his eyes scanning the area for any sign of Dr. Bradford or Jeremiah. There, at the edge of the water, he found them, the footprints. Deep, large tracks, just like the ones Dr. Bradford had described in his journal. They led into the woods, just as the others had, and without hesitation, Edward followed them, his mind filled with dread but also a burning need to find the truth. The further he walked into the woods, the more the air seemed to thicken, as if the very land was pressing in on him. The trees seemed to grow closer together, their branches twisting in unnatural patterns. The ground beneath his feet was soft, almost spongy, and every step he took felt like it was sinking into the earth. Then he saw it, the stone. It stood in the clearing, its surface covered in symbols that pulsed with an eerie energy. Edward approached it cautiously, his eyes narrowing as he studied the strange markings. This was the same stone that Dr. Bradford had found, the one that had been described in the journals, the one that held the secrets of Cedar Bluff. As Edward touched the stone, the ground trembled beneath him and a low, rumbling growl filled the air. He froze, his heart pounding in his chest. The sound was not like any animal he had ever heard. It was something deeper, something older, and as the growl grew louder, he felt a presence behind him, something large, something ancient watching him. Before he could turn, a shadow loomed over him. He spun around, his breath catching in his throat as he saw the creature, its eyes glowing with a deep, ember-like light. It was the same creature that had been seen by Dr. Bradford, by the others before him, but now it was here, standing before him in all its terrifying, grotesque form. "You should not have come," the creature intoned, its voice a low, guttural rumble. "The land does not welcome the curious." Edward's mind raced, but his body was frozen, as if the very air had wrapped around him, preventing him from moving. He wanted to speak, to ask what had happened to his brother, to ask why he had been brought here, but the words seemed to die in his throat. "You seek answers," the creature continued, its glowing eyes piercing into Edward's soul. "But some truths are better left unknown. Some things are not meant to be understood." The wind howled, and the creature took a step forward, its massive form blocking the path back to Riverton. Edward could feel the weight of its presence, the oppressive force that radiated from it, and in that moment he understood this was not just a creature of the woods. It was a guardian, an ancient force that had watched over the land for centuries, and it had no intention of letting him leave. Edward's heart raced as he realized the creature's words were not a warning, but a sentence. He had crossed a threshold that should not have been crossed, and now he would pay the price. With a sudden, violent movement, the creature lunged at him, its massive claws raking through the air. Edward stumbled backward, but he was no match for the creature's speed. Its claws pierced through the air, and just before he was overtaken, Edward's vision went dark, his body consumed by the same force that had claimed those before him. The forest fell silent once more. The creature's eyes burned brightly in the darkness, watching as another soul was claimed by the land, another soul bound to the river's eternal cycle. And as the river continued to flow, its waters swallowed another victim, another lost to the secrets of Cedar Bluff. Months passed since Edward Bradford's disappearance, and Riverton's town square became a little quieter, a little more somber. The older generations, who had lived through the early days of Cedar Bluff's rise and fall, spoke less and less of the river and the legends that clung to it. The younger folk, including those who had heard the stories, began to dismiss them as nothing more than dark tales, born of superstition and forgotten history. Life in Riverton continued. Life always found a way to move on, to adapt, to forget. But there were still whispers among those who remembered, those who felt the pull of the river's curse in their bones. The land of Cedar Bluff had claimed its share of souls, and its secrets remained buried beneath the surface. Only a few of the oldest townsfolk still kept the old stories alive, speaking them only in the dead of night, in hushed tones, as if afraid to utter the name of the land that had stolen so many lives. In the spring of 1903, a group of curious hikers from St. Louis ventured into the woods near Cedar Bluff. They were a mix of thrill-seekers and amateur historians, eager to explore the abandoned town and perhaps even stumble upon some forgotten relics of the past. They had heard the stories, of course, but they were young and skeptical, naive enough to believe they could make light of what had happened here so long ago. They saw only an opportunity for adventure. The group, led by a man named Charles Addison, arrived at the riverbank late one afternoon, their spirits high and their equipment ready. They were accustomed to hiking in wild places, but there was something unsettling about the woods around Cedar Bluff. Even as they set up camp near the river's edge, a strange, oppressive feeling settled over them. The air was thick with the scent of wet earth and decay, and the wind seemed to carry whispers that none of them could make sense of. By nightfall, the forest was dark, the trees looming over them like silent sentinels. The group sat around a campfire, chatting and laughing, trying to ignore the sense of unease that had settled over them. But as the fire crackled and the shadows deepened, one of the hikers, a woman named Mary Ellison, stood up and walked toward the edge of the river. "I'll be right back," she said, her voice a little too bright. "Just want to get a closer look at the water." Her companions, distracted by their conversation, didn't pay her much attention at first. But when Mary didn't return after several minutes, Charles Addison grew concerned. He rose from his seat and walked toward the riverbank, calling her name. The wind had picked up again, the river now louder, its churning current filling the air with a rhythmic, almost hypnotic sound. Charles reached the spot where Mary had last stood, but she was nowhere to be found. The tall grass along the river's edge swayed in the breeze, but there was no sign of her. "Mary!" Charles called again, but his voice seemed to disappear into the night. It was then that he noticed the tracks. The ground was soft near the water's edge, and there, deep in the mud, were the unmistakable prints, large, uneven, and shaped like no animal track he had ever seen. They were disturbingly human, but too large, the edges too blurred, as if the footprints had been made by something not entirely of this world. They led off into the woods, disappearing into the darkness. Charles stood still for a moment, heart pounding. There was something deeply wrong here, something ancient that none of them understood. The others, now gathering behind him, had begun to sense it too, the eerie silence, the unnatural cold that had descended on the forest. "I don't like this," one of the hikers, Thomas Baker, muttered. "Something's wrong with this place." Charles nodded grimly, but before he could respond, a low growl rippled through the trees, a sound deep and rumbling, vibrating through the ground beneath them. It was a noise unlike any animal growl, as if the forest itself had exhaled, a warning, a threat. They looked at each other, but no one spoke. The growl came again, this time closer, louder. And then, as if in answer to the sound, the creature appeared. It stepped out from the shadows of the trees, its massive form towering above them. Its eyes glowed, amber-like, burning with an ancient, unyielding light. Its grotesque, half-human, half-beast shape emerged from the darkness, its presence filling the space around them. The hikers froze, terror paralyzing them as they stared at the creature, unable to move, unable to flee. "You have disturbed what should not be disturbed," the creature said, its voice rumbling in their minds. It was not a voice spoken aloud, but one that filled their consciousness, a presence they could feel in the deepest part of their being. "You have walked into a place that does not belong to you." Charles tried to speak, his throat dry, but the words would not come. The creature's glowing eyes locked onto him, as if reading his thoughts, as if understanding every fear, every doubt. "You seek the past," the creature continued, its gaze shifting to the others. "But the past does not wish to be found. The land keeps its secrets, and those who try to unearth them will never leave." A deep, low growl escaped from the creature's chest, and the air grew colder, the wind picking up again. It moved toward them, its steps heavy and deliberate, as the ground beneath its feet trembled. "We will remain here," the creature intoned, "as we have always remained, and now you will join us." Panic surged through the group, but their legs were rooted to the spot, their bodies unwilling to obey their frantic minds. One by one they tried to move, but it was as if the land itself had claimed them, holding them in place. The creature's eyes glowed brighter, its form larger, more imposing. Then, with a deafening roar, it lunged. The forest fell silent once more. As the night grew darker, the fire in their camp flickered and died, leaving only the whispering winds and the churning river. The creatures of the woods, the guardians of the land, watched over the place as they had always done, silent, eternal, and unwavering. And Cedar Bluff, once a thriving settlement, was now another forgotten chapter in the land's unbroken cycle, waiting for the next soul to stumble upon its cursed shores. Spring arrived in Riverton, though the town's mood had become subdued, cast in a shadow that no season could lift. The stories of Cedar Bluff and its dark secrets continued to circulate, but only in whispers. Those who had known the river's call, those who had ventured too far into the woods, had either vanished or retreated into the safety of disbelief. No one spoke of the creature, no one spoke of the river, but the land, as always, remained unchanged, watching, waiting. In the quiet mornings of April 1904, as the first blooms began to poke through the earth, a letter arrived in Riverton. It was a letter from a distant relative of Dr. Edward Bradford, sent from across the country. The family had, at long last, given up on hearing from him, but they had managed to uncover a few remnants of his research, and they wanted to give closure to the mystery of his disappearance. The letter, brief and formal, outlined the discovery of a box of papers, journals, and books, Dr. Bradford's belongings, which had been found in a cabin not far from Cedar Bluff, some months after his disappearance. The letter's sender, a distant cousin named Sarah Bradford, suggested that perhaps the townspeople of Riverton could shed light on what happened to him, since it seemed his investigation had led him to Cedar Bluff, the very place where so many other souls had been claimed. Curious and uneasy, the local historian, Daniel Price, agreed to meet Sarah. He had heard the stories, of course, but he was a man of rational thought, a man determined to piece together Riverton's past, to separate myth from reality. Price believed that Dr. Bradford's disappearance was nothing more than the result of a man's obsession with something that was simply too dangerous. No supernatural forces at work, just human folly. But as he agreed to meet Sarah Bradford and review what had been found, he had no idea that the past would return to haunt him. The meeting took place in the Riverton Library, which was located in an old brick building that smelled of dust and ink. Sarah Bradford, a quiet woman in her late 40s, greeted Daniel Price with a grim smile and handed him the box of documents. The contents were a mix of letters, notes, and a journal, Dr. Bradford's last remaining pieces of writing. As Price read through the journal, he felt a chill creeping over him. It was as if the very words were alive, pulling him into the story of Cedar Bluff, of its haunted land, and of the creature that had watched over it for centuries. Dr. Bradford's final entries were filled with descriptions of strange, unsettling events, encounters with something that had not been entirely human. The same creature, described in earlier journals, but this time, Bradford had written about it in much more detail. The last entry in the journal, dated the night before Bradford's disappearance, described a moment when he had finally come face to face with the creature. It was not just a guardian of the land as the old stories had suggested. It was something much darker, something tied to the river itself. Bradford had written that he felt the creature was not merely protecting the land, but was, in fact, part of the river, its guardian, yes, but also its servant, trapped in an eternal cycle. Bradford had spoken of the river's power, the force that kept the land bound in a state of constant renewal. He had written that those who crossed into Cedar Bluff's territory, who disturbed its balance, would be bound to the land forever. They would become part of the river, part of the forest, part of the creature itself. Price, who had been silently reading the journal as Sarah sat across from him, was unable to stop himself from speaking aloud. "Is this true?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah, who had been listening with a quiet intensity, nodded. "My family has heard the stories. We know what happened to Edward, Dr. Bradford, and the others. I believe he found something in Cedar Bluff, something that we shouldn't have known." As Daniel Price sat there staring at the journal, the weight of the land's curse seemed to settle upon him. It was a curse that had spanned generations, one that no one had ever truly escaped. The river, the land, the creature, it was all part of an unending cycle. The living were drawn to it, and in the end they became part of it. No one could resist its pull. Price stood up abruptly, the journal still in his hands. He felt the urgency of the truth pushing him forward, the desire to share it with Riverton's people, to reveal the truth of what had happened to Dr. Bradford and the others. But as he turned to speak, a shadow passed across the room. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. The wind outside had picked up, rattling the windows of the library, and the air seemed to grow thick, almost oppressive. Sarah, too, had noticed the change, her expression growing pale. "We should leave," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "It's not safe." But Price wasn't sure if she meant the library or Riverton itself. Suddenly, from somewhere in the distance, there came a low growl, a rumbling sound that seemed to rise from the earth itself. It was deep and guttural, and for a moment the very air seemed to shake with the power of it. Price dropped the journal, his heart pounding. He turned to Sarah, but she was already backing away, her eyes wide with fear. "Do you hear it?" she asked, her voice trembling. Price nodded, his mind racing. "It's the same sound," he whispered. "The creature, it's here." They both turned toward the door, and in that moment the shadows in the room seemed to grow deeper, as though the very walls were closing in on them. The land was calling once again. The river's guardian had awoken. Price and Sarah rushed out of the library, the growl echoing in the distance. They had crossed into Cedar Bluff's domain once again, and it was not going to let them leave. The river flowed on, as it always had, its currents relentless, its depths hiding the secrets of those who had ventured too close. The moon hung high over Riverton, casting its pale light over the town as Daniel Price and Sarah Bradford rushed down the narrow streets, the growl of the creature reverberating through the trees behind them. The sound was unlike any natural noise, deeper than the growl of a bear or the howl of a wolf. It was the kind of sound that resonated in their very bones, a rumble that seemed to come from the earth itself, pulling at the fabric of the town's reality. By the time they reached the edge of town, the chill in the air had become unbearable. The wind had picked up again, whipping through the trees, and the streets of Riverton were eerily silent. No one else seemed to be awake, as if the entire town had fallen under a strange spell. The only sound that filled the air was the distant growl, now louder and more insistent, as if the creature was drawing closer. "We need to get out of here," Sarah said urgently, her voice trembling with fear. "We have to leave Riverton before it's too late." Price didn't argue. He had long since realized that there was no escaping the curse that had bound Cedar Bluff to the river. The creature, the land, it was all part of a cycle that had existed long before Riverton had been founded, long before anyone had set foot on this land. And now, the cycle was coming full circle. They made their way to the outskirts of town, where the trees thickened and the path grew more difficult to navigate. The dense forest loomed ahead, a dark mass of shadows that seemed to swallow the light from the moon. The air smelled of wet earth and decay, and the low growl continued to echo in the distance, growing louder closer. As they entered the woods, a sense of suffocating dread settled over them. The trees were tall and gnarled, their branches twisting and reaching out like skeletal arms. The ground was soft and damp beneath their feet, and every step they took seemed to sink deeper into the earth. The oppressive silence around them was broken only by the sound of their hurried breathing and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. "This is where it all began," Price said quietly, his voice filled with a mixture of awe and fear. "Cedar Bluff, the land has always held its secrets." Sarah glanced at him, her face pale. "It's not just the land," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "It's the river, the creature it's tied to the water. That's what my family never told me. They were too afraid to speak of it, but I've heard the stories, the same ones they told about the guardians of the river. They were here long before the settlers arrived." Price felt a cold shiver run down his spine. He had suspected as much, but hearing it out loud made it all too real. The creature was not just a guardian, not just a protector of the land. It was something that had always been tied to the river, to the very flow of time itself. And now it was claiming those who had dared to uncover its secrets. "We shouldn't have come back," Sarah continued, her voice quivering. "We thought we could escape, but it's never over. The river claims its own, and it's taken my family, my brother, and now you and I are next." Price stopped in his tracks, a sudden realization dawning on him. "The creature," he said slowly, his eyes widening. "It's not just a guardian, it's part of the river, part of the land itself. It's been waiting for us to return to disturb the balance." Sarah nodded, her face grim. "And now it won't let us leave. It will claim us just like the others. It doesn't matter if we're from Riverton or elsewhere. The land is its domain, and we've crossed into its territory. Once you do that, there's no turning back." They continued their trek into the heart of the forest, the growl now unmistakably close, the air thick with an unnatural stillness. The woods felt alive, as if the very trees were watching them, their twisted forms stretching out in every direction. They reached the riverbank, the water dark and foreboding, its surface calm yet filled with an eerie energy. There at the water's edge they saw it, the stone. The same one Dr. Bradford had found, the one that had been etched with ancient symbols. The markings were barely visible now, weathered by time but still unmistakable. The stone stood as a silent testament to the dark history of Cedar Bluff, to the creature and the land that had never truly released its hold. "It's here," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. "The river's power is here." As they approached the stone, the growl grew louder until it felt as though the earth itself was shaking. The creature was close, its presence overwhelming, and Sarah's fear was palpable. But she held her ground, her eyes fixed on the stone, as if trying to decipher the ancient markings that had driven so many before her into madness. "We have to do something," Price said, his voice filled with urgency. "We can't just stand here and wait for it to take us." But Sarah's face was filled with resignation. "There's nothing we can do," she said softly. "It's too late. The land is already claiming us." Just then the creature emerged from the shadows, its massive form towering over them. The growl had stopped, and the creature's eyes, glowing with an amber light, fixed on them with a cold, ancient gaze. It stepped closer, its heavy footfalls sending vibrations through the ground. "You have disturbed the land," it said, its voice deep and resonant like the rumble of thunder. "And now you will become part of it." The words were a sentence, not a warning. Price and Sarah stood frozen, their bodies too numb with fear to move. The creature's gaze locked onto them, its eyes burning with the weight of centuries of power. With a final, terrifying roar, the creature lunged forward, its massive claws outstretched. The air around them seemed to crack and twist, and for a brief moment everything went dark. The river surged violently, and the woods fell silent once more. The creature, the land, and the river had claimed their final victims, and the cycle would begin again. In the years that followed the disappearance of Sarah Bradford and Daniel Price, Riverton, though still alive, seemed to carry with it an unshakable weight, a silent acknowledgement of the cursed land that lay just beyond the town's borders. The river, ever present and endless, continued its course, flowing through the region as it always had, but the once vibrant community that had grown around it now seemed to feel its pull, a quiet undertone of dread in every conversation. Riverton's residents, though no longer speaking of the events at Cedar Bluff, carried a sense of knowing in their hearts. It was as if the land itself had marked them, its influence lingering in the shadows of their daily lives. The younger generations who grew up hearing of the disappearances and of the strange happenings at the river's edge were taught to avoid the woods, to stay far from the town's abandoned ruins. But for all their efforts, the pull of Cedar Bluff never truly faded. The old stories lived on in the quiet corners of the town, passed down like warnings from parent to child. It was said that, sometimes, when the wind was just right, you could hear the echoes of the river's growl, a low rumble in the distance, calling out to those who had dared to seek the truth. And sometimes it was said, in the quiet of the night, a shadow would pass through the town, seen only by those who were looking for it, large, hulking, with eyes that glowed in the dark. It was never close enough to fully make out, but always present in the periphery, a reminder of what had been and what could never be escaped. Yet, despite the warnings, the fear, and the whispered legends, Riverton continued. People married, had children, and lived their lives as best they could, but always with the quiet knowledge that something older, something darker, watched from the forest's edge, from the river's depths. As the years went by, the ruins of Cedar Bluff slowly faded into obscurity, overtaken by time and nature. The cabins were reduced to little more than heaps of rotting wood and collapsed beams. The stone with the strange symbols was buried beneath moss and vines, its secrets swallowed by the earth. The river flowed on, indifferent to the lives that had come and gone, to the souls it had claimed. But for those few who had ventured too close, those who had disturbed the land's ancient balance, Cedar Bluff remained a place of terror, an inescapable truth. The cycle, it seemed, had not been broken. For the land, the river, and the creature were always watching, waiting for the next curious soul to step too far into the darkness. The stories of Cedar Bluff would never truly fade, for there were always those who would seek out the past, hoping to uncover its secrets, unaware that in doing so, they would only become part of the land's eternal cycle. The river, with its dark currents and hidden depths, would claim them all in time, just as it had claimed so many before. And so the legend of Cedar Bluff lived on, in the whispers of the wind, in the shadows of the forest, and in the flow of the river, a never-ending story, a curse that could never be broken. The cycle continues,